Yeah, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Vondi. I am Preservation Program Manager for the State Historic Preservation Office, and welcome to today's webinar, Architecture 101, the Architecture of Arizona's Working Class Communities. These webinars are a collaboration between the Arizona Preservation Foundation, the state's only statewide historic preservation nonprofit, and the State Historic Preservation Office. These webinars were a product of the pandemic, the first having been done in August of 2020. They've covered a diverse range of topics from sustainability and preservation to the Butterfield Trail to identification of historic cans and bottles. At this point, we have done more than 20 of them. And today's focus is on the working class buildings or working class and minority communities in Arizona. And I would like to, at this point, introduce Margaret Hangen, who is an archaeologist for the Forest Service out of Tonto National Forest. And Margaret, over to you.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. And I don't know if Eric mentioned, but all of these are recorded and they are maintained on the APF Zoom channel, or not Zoom channel, sorry, YouTube channel. So you can get through the Arizona Preservation Foundation's YouTube channel either by Googling it or through their website. And all of these, there's some really great topics and some really great information. So please take advantage of that. And this will also be recorded and posted there within a few days. So meanwhile, it's my job here to introduce Jennifer. Jennifer, is it Levstik or Levstik?
It's Levstik.
It's Levstik. Thank you, because I didn't want to completely botch that.
That's fine. I'm used to it.
I know you are. So allow me to give you a little background on Jennifer. And Jennifer is going to be joined by Josefina Cardenas, who will join her in her presentation. And I'm going to let Jennifer introduce Josefina. But meanwhile, Jennifer has 26 years of experience in cultural resource management and historic preservation. She has worked throughout Arizona, New Mexico, California, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, and Colorado, and has broad experience as an architectural historian, archaeological field director, and planner. She was the former lead planner for the Tucson Historic Preservation Office and has extensive experience preparing National Register of Historic Places nominations, which you are going to certainly hear about that today, and eligibility reports, historic American building surveys, engineering records, HABS, for those who want to know, and landscape level documentation, HABS, HAER, and HAL. Building conditions and assessment documentation, historic preservation, master plans, and architectural inventories. Jennifer also serves as an adjunct instructor with the University of Arizona College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture, is the vice chair of the Tucson-Pima County Historical Commission, and formerly served on the board of the Southern Arizona chapter of the American Institute of Architects, AIA, for those who like the short bit. So take it away, Jennifer.
Well, perfect. Before I get started, I wanted to introduce Josefina, who is my co-presenter, who'll be talking a little bit today. I can't see who's on the screen, so Josefina, if you're there, if you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Josefina Cardenas. I'm a native Tucsonan and born where my father was raised, and now I have raised my children and grandchildren in Barrio Kroger Lane below Sentinel Peak along the Santa Cruz River.
Great, thank you. So Josefina will be talking a little bit later in this presentation about some of the grassroots efforts that she has been involved in. She's been a very active member in her neighborhood, in her community. And for those of you that have been at some of our preservation conferences over the last several years, you might have had an opportunity to listen to some of her presentations, especially about issues of gentrification in her neighborhood. And so with that, I will get started. I promise not to take the 2 hours because that's a long time for me to be talking and for you guys to sit and listen. So I'm hoping to open up a good section of this webinar today for questions that you all might have. So yes, as Eric mentioned, this is the Architecture of Arizona's Working Class Communities. So again, any of those of you that have had an opportunity to go to some of these presentations I've done on sort of related topics, which some of you may have already heard and seen, but hopefully today will be a slightly different take on a theme that I've been talking about at the last couple of preservation conferences. So before we begin, I just direct you to the cover photo here, the beginning of this presentation. So this is a picture here in Tucson of Barrio Libre, or what we're referring to as part of Los Barrios Viejos. This is a shot down Convent Street, and this is a really perfectly good example of working class architecture. And these are Sonoran vernacular adobe row houses, many of which housed former railroad workers. On either side of this community, there were two railroads, Southern Pacific and the El Paso and Southwestern. Excuse me. I will also mention that my dogs may make an appearance during this presentation, so I'm sorry if they interrupt. Excuse me. So before we get into some project specific examples, I want to just do a couple definitions. And again, I'm going to have a lot of text in a lot of these presentations, so I will not bore you all by reading them to you, but I just kind of want to go over a couple sort of how we're defining working class and how we're defining vernacular architecture, because those are the two definitions that are going to be brought up repeatedly throughout this presentation. So again, you know, the working class are typically people who are employed in manual or industrial work. In most situations, particularly in Arizona, since we're going to be looking at Arizona specifically, oftentimes when we talk about the working class, we're typically associating these with communities of color. And then vernacular architecture, you know, quite simply put, is architecture that's made at the local level. It's not done by an architect. It's usually a community that builds it. It's usually a builder, not an architect, as I said. And one of the things that I find most interesting about vernacular architecture, and some of the examples that we'll talk about today will reinforce this, which is that, you know, not only does it evolve over time, but it also it changes to reflect the cultural groups that are within those particular communities or within that particular residence. See here. So before we get into some project examples, I kind of wanted to do a very brief historical overview. The background picture that you see behind there is an example of tenement housing in New York City. So, you know, in the 1800s, when we think about working class housing, we think typically, excuse me, we most typically think about these sort of tenement housing. So we think about really dense urban areas where we see people sort of stacked on top of each other, which is markedly different than what we see in the West, in Arizona in particular, and especially in places like Tucson, where I do most of my work, which is that here what we see are neighborhoods and communities rather than urban areas where you might have a working class neighborhood, but it's not at that neighborhood scale, which is more of what we're going to be looking at today. So, you know, this is kind of the typical model, which is sort of the tenement housing or multifamily housing as workforce housing or working class housing. And really not until about the early 1900s that through various, you know, housing laws, factory worker laws, those kinds of things that, you know, start getting implemented where we actually start seeing a noticeable improvement in people's living conditions. And so oftentimes some of the things that we would have typically associated with, you know, upper or even middle to upper middle class families, we're starting to see that those kind of amenities are being offered to the quote unquote working class. In Arizona, you know, most of the time when we talk about the working class, you know, we usually equate it with what I sort of call workforce, you know, with workforce housing. And typically what we see with that is that workforce housing is often associated with the railroad or agricultural industries or mining. You know, lots of times we see company towns, those sorts of things, so that you have, you know, housing for your workforce, and you typically house them close to their place of work. And then in the early to mid 20th century, you know, this is when we start seeing these neighborhoods in larger communities, much more in a sort of a suburban context rather than in an urban context. And, you know, one of the other things that we see with these kinds of neighborhoods is that typically where they're located is, again, usually within walking distance or, you know, public transportation distance to their, you know, employer or where they're working. But most of the time we see these neighborhoods essentially emerging on the fringes of either this urban core or on the margins, depending on where they are, if it's an agricultural community, for example. And so location is one of the things that's, really critically important to think about when you start doing evaluations of these kinds of neighborhoods and communities. So what I wanted to do is just sort of give you kind of an overview of the basic or the common features that you're going to see if you have a project, for example, where you're asked to evaluate one of these neighborhoods or communities. As I mentioned before, location is really key because there are patterns that we see with where these communities are located. Again, as I mentioned, they're typically on the edges or the outskirts of either your downtown or your central business district. And again, they're usually located relatively close or walking distance with a particular industry, so the railroad or mining or something along those lines. Setting is also another critical component of this too, and it's not exactly the same as location, but they're certainly tied together. Setting usually in these cases is there's mixed use development in these kinds of communities. There's often industrial development, either encroaching in or along the edges of these kinds of neighborhoods. Oftentimes, with the exception of agricultural communities that might be more rural in nature, but they're much more urban looking. There's not a lot of vegetation. There's not a lot of landscaping, those sorts of things. As mentioned before, vernacular architecture is usually the sort of predominant architecture that you're going to see. And again, oftentimes that's associated with the economic resources that are available to those living in those kind of communities. And then that slightly changes in the post-war period, the post-World War II period, where we start seeing these kinds of neighborhoods with repeating standard type. And what I mean by this is that you'll have prefab homes, or you'll have like 3 or 4, floor plan models that are available within a community. We see this pretty typically, at least here in Tucson, with those neighborhoods that were created to accommodate Davis-Monthan Air Force Base and some of the Air Force not necessarily the Air Force, but the airline industry, those kinds of things, and the military industry, where you have like 3 or 4 houses of similar type, very similar setback, those kinds of things. Interestingly, over time, those communities, and we can talk about that again a little bit later, is those kinds of communities that started out with this assumption of catering to returning war veterans, for example, that started out as typically, lower to somewhat, middle class white communities have kind of shifted over the years, and now they're either predominantly populated by people of color, or there's a mixed population demographic within those now. One of the other interesting things that we see, which is a pretty common pattern with these kinds of communities, is alterations and additions. And a lot of times, folks don't have the financial resources to move and buy a larger house or move into a different kind of neighborhood. And so in order to accommodate, a growing family, for example, alterations need to be made to those homes, additions also need to be made. So there's alterations oftentimes too come in sort of a cultural package. And so something like, your VA housing that you have, and the line right before it, might have started out that way. And then you have a community, particularly a Mexican-American community, that is going to make alterations to those standard types to fit their own cultural tastes. And that's something we're going to talk about again in a little bit. Not surprisingly, most of the housing is going to be modest in scale, again, because of, the kinds of financial resources that are available to those that live in those communities. And then one of the other things that I've noticed is a lack of neighborhood amenities and infrastructure. And so oftentimes you may not get sidewalks, or if you do, you'll have a sidewalk on one part of the street, not another. Curbs, those kinds of things oftentimes don't always get included in these neighborhoods. They're very sort of slapdash, or the way that they get developed over time isn't sort of consistent in the sort of suburban neighborhoods that we're used to seeing. And a lot of times there's not like a community center, there's not necessarily a park. Over the last several decades, however, this is changing. So oftentimes now these communities will actually have a neighborhood park, or they may have a community center. And the reasons for this is because those neighborhoods themselves have actively, advocated for those, have worked with their municipalities in order to get those kinds of amenities. But oftentimes those amenities did not come with the origins of those community, or at least the initial establishment and development of those communities. So that is kind of the overview of the sort of the main components. And again, this is applicable to, multiple types of working class communities. So it doesn't necessarily have to be with those communities of color, although most of the ones that we're going to talk about today would fall under that kind of classification. So I wanted to share this kind of long quote with you all. And while this is specific to, Latinos, this is also applicable to lots of other communities of color, particularly working class communities of color. And again, this is where that sort of that discussion of location really comes into play, which is that, where you see these kinds of communities, as, Ray Suarez notes, is that these kinds of folks are flowing into the places that are used up or abandoned by other Americans, in this case, typically, white Anglo-Americans. But this is really important to sort of think about when you're evaluating these kinds of communities. And this is also really relevant to the case studies that we're going to talk about today. And I'll give you guys a second to read that before I shift to the next. Oh, there we go. So one of the first communities that I wanted to talk about, or neighborhoods that I wanted to talk about, is Barrio Kroger Lane, which Josefina will talk a little bit more about in a bit. And so, this is a largely Mexican-American community. It started out that way. There's a little bit more sort of demographic diversity now, in part because of its location. It is basically west of the downtown Tucson, on the west side, or, on the other, well, actually sort of sandwiched between Interstate 10 and the Santa Cruz River. And so this area now is kind of ripe for development, and gentrification is certainly an issue, as Josefina knows. And excuse me, let me drink some water here so I stop coughing. So anyway, so my involvement in this project was in part because of the concerns of a lot of the revitalization efforts that have been happening in downtown Tucson, which is good on many levels, but it's also somewhat detrimental to some of these historically Mexican-American communities that have been in this area for, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, as originally established, this neighborhood was once part of what we would consider, Los Barrios Viejos. It would have been an extension of those barrios that we see, for example, that was on the introductory slide. And, not surprising, and also a very typical pattern of these kind of communities is that roads, highways, those kinds of developments oftentimes intrude right through these neighborhoods. So, when Interstate 10 came in, it started out as a surface level interstate. And eventually it was made into an elevated interstate as we see today. But one of the things that happened through this is that it cut off Barrio Kroger Lane from the rest of the downtown barrios that was historically associated with. And as a result, there's been all kinds of really interesting things that have been happening. One is that it still maintains a really high Mexican-American community, which is great considering that Los Barrios Viejos on the east side of the interstate is probably, I would wager that less than 1% of the owner occupancy there is of Mexican-American descent or ownership, which is unfortunate considering that is who originally established and inhabited that area. But when looking at this neighborhood, and also a couple other neighborhoods that we'll talk about more here in a little bit, is sort of looking at kind of some of the patterns that we're seeing with these kinds of communities, particularly Mexican-American communities. And, we have this sort of list here on the right-hand side, and these are the kind of the character defining features that, I and my colleagues have come up with because we're seeing repeating patterns. So not just within Barrio Kroger Lane, but also Barrio San Antonio, and also projects that I've done in Colorado where we've had similar kinds of communities. And again, it's, there's vernacular architecture. Because this is Tucson specific, adobe is the predominant building material. Stucco is also another feature, oftentimes in bright colors. The architecture, of course, is locally made. It's made by the people that live there, their community members, their neighbors, those sorts of things, not an architect designed. One of the other typical patterns that we see in this neighborhood and lots of other similar kinds of neighborhoods is the use of walls. You know, there's been lots of studies that have been done on Latinx urbanism, especially out of LA. So if anybody's really interested, there's some really good work coming out of LA right now on this topic. But walls are a very typical pattern that we see in Mexican-American neighborhoods. And the walls are not simply, you know, a function of trying to keep people out, but actually these are sort of reminiscent of these row house typologies where courtyards, which would have at that point been in the back, but courtyards are very important facet, not only of, you know, this kinds of architecture, but also Mexican-American community. And so the front of your house is not the front door necessarily. The front of your house is the gate at your wall, and that becomes the entry into your home. And you have courtyard space, which is shared communal space. Additionally, nichos, which are also shrines, as you'll see in that bottom picture. Shrines are also a very common feature. Again, a lot of folks are Catholic that live in these communities. One of the other patterns that I've noticed as well with these kinds of working class communities and also largely Mexican-American neighborhoods is that there's irregular lot lines and setbacks. So, you know, a lot of times what we see in sort of typical Anglo-American middle-class neighborhoods is that the houses are all set back identically. They're all set in the middle of their lot. So there's a uniformity to it that doesn't often exist in these kinds of neighborhoods. And so you may have a couple houses that have the same lot lines or the same setbacks, but two houses down, somebody might have the house on the back of the lot, somebody might have it right at the sidewalk, somebody might have it catty corner. So there's no regularity necessarily to placement or setback. So there's a much more organic feel to a lot of these neighborhoods. The other thing too is alleyways. Again, this is also specific to place because not all of these kinds of communities are going to necessarily have alleyways, but alleyways are pretty typical in Tucson. And so alleyways also become communal space. It's not simply a place where you put, you know, your garbage can or your dumpster, or you just drive through. But alleyways become, you know, communal space between neighbors. It's a place to congregate. It's a place to talk to, you know, your neighbors and things. One of the interesting things about Barrio Kroger Lane is there is a slight rural quality to it, even though it is essentially within this sort of the downtown area, and it is a very urban area. However, its proximity to the river, the fact that it was historically started out as an agricultural area, and also because, you know, it was cut off from the rest of downtown through the intrusion of the interstate, that there is this sort of unique rural quality to it. Lots of folks that live there still have horses. They have, you know, chickens. They have all kinds of, you know, animals and things. There's still lots of vegetation still within this neighborhood, despite the fact that it is pretty much in an urbanized area. And then the other interesting thing about these communities, and again, we see this a lot, is what we call additive growth. And it's something that I talked about in a couple slides previous to this, is that, again, because most people are confined to staying in their homes and not just, you know, leaving and buying a brand new larger house, that, you know, as their needs change, their family size changes, is that rooms are a pretty common feature. Additional rooms that are added onto the house. And most of the time what we see is these additions are typically to the rear of the house. So the houses kind of get longer over time. So it'll start out with like a 4-room plan, and then the house gets incrementally larger room by room by room over time, depending on what people need. And again, this is also very reminiscent of this sort of early Spanish architecture that we see in the oldest barrios, like Los Barrios Viejos, where you have a row house. And so if you need to add on to it, you typically add to the back because that's the only room that you have available because your house is abutting your neighbor's house. And so even though we have freestanding houses and these kinds of neighborhoods, we also see that kind of sort of tradition continues, where you continue to add to the back of your house rather than adding to the front or taking away from that courtyard space. All right, let me move on to the next slide. In a similar neighborhood, this Barrio San Antonio. And this one's an interesting kind of mix of Barrio Kroger Lane and some of the neighboring Miles neighborhood, for example, which is pretty much typically a white, also somewhat middle class, or excuse me, working class, but largely, middle class neighborhood. And they're both kind of developed simultaneously. But this neighborhood, even though they're side by side, this neighborhood developed kind of differently. So what it is it's a mix of some of these earlier, more Spanish or Mexican American, traditions as far as, what kinds of materials are being used. For example, some homes are made of adobe, but then there's also this attempt to combine that with these more anglicized models that they're seeing in their adjacent neighborhoods. And so these two houses are kind of good examples of that. So the top one is, locally we'd refer to this as American Territorial. I think Bill Collins would disagree with me on that. But but you can also, and then on the bottom there is sort of a bungalow, which again, is much more anglicized architectural styles. However, there are, unique changes and things that have been done to these. So they're made out of adobe. The where it's placed on the lot is slightly different. The fencing, those kinds of things. One on the top, of course, obviously has had some work going on with it currently. But again, we also see the walls and fencing again. We also have these sort of, the homes get larger through accretion with these additional rooms. We also still see the use of shrines, and some of that irregularity and setback. There's a little bit more consistency in this neighborhood, but basically it's a really nice intermediary between these early, late, mid to late 1800s era barrios in the downtown to what's happening when, Mexican Americans start getting the opportunity to move outside of the downtown area. And so by comparison, at least when this community was created in the early 1920s, is that by comparison to its downtown neighbors, this was considered quote unquote middle class, even though basically we would really categorize it as a working class neighborhood. And so what's happened, partly with this neighborhood is that even though at the time it was close to the railroad, which many of the people that moved here worked at the railroad, and it was an opportunity for some, growth outside of the downtown area by moving into this neighborhood. But one of the things that has happened over time is because even though it was considered a middle class Latinx neighborhood, the city still viewed it as marginal, and so industrial development continued to encroach into this neighborhood. Once again, a highway came through and cut the neighborhood off from their place of employment, the railroad and downtown area. So again, there's a lot of disenfranchisement that we continue to see in these kinds of neighborhoods. Industrial development is pretty typical, as well as interstates. The interstate system has been fairly detrimental to any community of color, regardless of, whether or not they're low income or working class. Here's just a couple examples of similar projects in, so Spanish Colony is a largely Mexican-American working class neighborhood in Greeley, Colorado. And then the La Raza neighborhood is in Montrose, Colorado. And again, you can see some similarities with the neighborhoods that we just talked about here in Tucson, but also same thing. Location along the margins of the downtown area, lots of industrial development within proximity of their place of employment, small, modest scale homes, again, vernacular architecture, lots of use of, fencing, those sorts of things. So again, this is not simply just Arizona, even though most of what I'm talking about obviously is Arizona, but there are some crossovers with other neighboring states. One of our more recent projects is the community of Randolph, which is the oldest surviving historically Black community. There's about 5 Black communities or towns established in Arizona. So this is not, we're not talking specifically about the other neighborhoods like in Phoenix, for example, or even in Tucson, where we've got about 5 historically Black neighborhoods in Tucson. But this is an agricultural community. And so, this develops slightly differently than the Barrio San Antonio or Barrio, Viejo areas, those kinds of things. But again, we have lots of commonalities where it's single story. There's a regular lot placement, there's industrial development. Even though this is an agricultural area, it's slowly getting encroached on by industrial development. Walls and fencing are another typical pattern that we see. In this picture, this is sort of showing these are, excuse me. So in this picture, there's 2 of the buildings and are some of the earliest buildings that are in this community. And this is very typical of what the housing would have looked like, at the start of this community in the 1920s, when African Americans were being actively recruited to come here to pick cotton. And these are essentially what we'd refer to as shotgun style houses. Again, that's a sort of a vernacular architectural form. It's not particularly a style, but most of you are probably familiar with shotgun style homes, like in New Orleans, for example. Those are typically closer to each other. Again, it's a very popular model that people use for workforce housing, especially in the South. And so we see a little bit of that replicated out here in the desert. One of the other sort of interesting things about Randolph anyway is that where in the Mexican American communities, what we're seeing is this additive growth or this incremental additions to the houses over time. In Randolph, instead of necessarily adding multiple additions, what most people did was they would keep their house and then they'd either build another house on the property, because a lot of these lots and parcels that people that owned or rented were really large. And so they either put a mobile home, manufactured home, or a third home, or a second home on that lot. So instead of adding to their homes, they actually added a standalone other residents on the lot. The other interesting thing too about Randolph is that there is little to no landscaping. I don't know if part of that is a function of having to work in agricultural fields all day. The last thing you really want to do is maintain a yard, or whether or not there's any kind of cultural component to it or not. I have read some things with the Park Service that have talked about how dirt lawns are very common, quote unquote dirt lawns, like lawn is for lack of a better description, but those are much more typical in African American communities where the dirt is swept and raked and kept clean and neat and orderly, and that there is some relationship to some of West African countries where this is a common practice. But again, I don't know the validity of any of that. So I'm not arguing that that's the case, but anyway, that is one of the features of Randolph. And then, excuse me. So this is one of the communities that Eric Vondi and I have been kind of talking about on and off for years. And this started out as essentially a, white middle class, or excuse me, not middle class, white working class neighborhood. These, so Pueblo Gardens is pretty much the first modernist tract housing development in the United States, and happened to be in Tucson. And this was to house, returning veterans after that post-World War II period. And this was on sort of the southeast end of town. They had well-known architects, one of which was Quincy Jones. There you go. I totally forgot his name. And Paul R. Williams, for those of you that are familiar with Paul R. Williams, he is one of the more predominant African-American architects. He was sort of Hollywood's architect. He designed lots of homes for very wealthy actors and actresses in Hollywood. But he was also one of the co-architects on this project. So it's really interesting modernist architecture that's there. And over the last probably since the 1970s or so, this neighborhood has completely changed as far as its sort of overall look. So, you know, these pictures, we have the nice white folks that they're trying to sell to, lining up to be able to get an affordable house for their family. But over time, this neighborhood has become largely Mexican-American and also African-American. It's one of the few neighborhoods in Tucson that has an MLK Day that they celebrate as part of the neighborhood. But again, it's single story. In this case, these started out as frame houses, which again is not a particularly smart decision in a desert. And so when the demographics of that neighborhood changed, those neighbors started stuccoing those frame structures, in part for, you know, for thermal properties, but also part maybe for personal taste as well. And then as originally designed, these did not have walls and fencing. And those were all added later on over the last, you know, several decades. Walls and fencing are now a common feature. Additive growth is now a common feature, where carports are now filled in, those sorts of things. The colors have changed. This had a pretty muted color palette as originally designed, you know, lots of browns and reds and, you know, there's more subtle colors. And now there's, you know, purples and reds and yellows and all kinds of things like that. The difference with this community is because it started out as this sort of, you know, modernist designed community. And unlike some of these other neighborhoods where they started a little bit more organically, and this was subdivided and platted in much more irregular. So your setbacks are going to be similar. Their lot placement's going to be similar because those were already predetermined, pre-designed when the newer residents moved in. But yeah, this is one's a really cool case study, and at some point we can do something more with it. But I wanted to talk about you know, a community that was slightly different than the three I just spoke about. So here's another long quote for everybody to read. So as I mentioned, you know, some of the challenges that we have with these working class communities is there have been, you know, issues of quote unquote integrity, right? So, you know, as the National Register defines integrity, which is, you know, basically the property's ability to convey its significance, right? But the way that integrity gets interpreted oftentimes is associated with its physical integrity rather than its integrity of association or significance. And so when, as historic preservation professionals, typically when we see these kinds of alterations and changes to properties, we automatically assume that those alterations and changes have now taken away its integrity so that it's no longer eligible for listing in the National Register, for example. So walls are a really good place to start, where typically if somebody has a wall in front of their house, like a solid block wall, for example, that's over 5 feet, automatically that keeps that property from being listed in the National Register because it's, you know, not necessarily fully visible from the street, those sorts of things. You know, additions typically are frowned upon unless they're made within a certain time frame or whatever it may be. But, you know, one of the challenges with that is that in these kinds of communities, those are typical patterns in those communities. And so those are not things that are detrimental to the integrity. If anything, it enhances it. As this quote sort of, you know, suggests, is that, you know, these are actually cultural markers, not simply just, you know, oh, somebody went and kind of mucked up the outside of their house. So and as somebody who does National Register nominations for these kinds of properties, you know, this is an issue that we come up against on a continual basis, which is sort of, you know, proving that these changes are, you know, an enhancement to the history of these neighborhoods rather than a detriment to them. And now I will stop talking for a minute. I wanted to invite Josefina to talk a little bit about some of the grassroots efforts that she and her neighbors have been doing on behalf of Barrio Kroger Lane. And then I can talk a little bit about what we've done with Barrio San Antonio and Randolph. All right. Thanks, Josefina.
Thank you. How much time would you want me to speak for? Because I can go on and on, no?
Well, let's see. It is almost 1:45. So if we want to let people ask some questions, because I'm pretty much done after this. So yeah, if you want to talk for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, you go for it.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity and also this teaching that I have just learned from you. And then maybe we'll ask at the end of my conversation, but I'm curious to know in our audience how many new in this new field of architect and planning, how many individuals are new to this, because I'm wondering if we're preaching to the choir and how it would be different. So maybe have that in mind. And I would like to also learn from you. So going back to Barrio Kroger Lane and just hearing what we were just said, how significant it is for developers and planners and architects to look at the area, ask permission to the area before developing, because Barrio Kroger Lane is below Sentinel Peak, a mountain along the Santa Cruz River, and it used to be the outskirts of downtown Tucson. So it was rural farms, ranches along the Santa Cruz River. The ASIC is the irrigation canals, and people know each other. No, the farm area, the horsemanship is along the Santa Cruz River, still up to this date. So that makes a lot of significance of these areas, and also the bodies of water, to also pay attention to those in the space developers are working on, architects, now planners, because learning from Barrio Kroger Lane, we're right in the center. We're embraced by bodies of water. There's the Julian Wash to the east, the Santa Cruz River to the west, and we're in the middle. So also I have never been able to figure out why in the world would streets be built away from the Santa Cruz River and away from the mountain, instead of having the beautiful view of the mountain. No, we either have the side or the back of our homes, which is good, but just to have that in mind of what we do concerning Mother Earth, because Mother Earth and its wildlife, its living beings are also part of our community. In fact, they were there first before we decided to develop and make our home there. So being below the mountain, the river, we have this wildlife coming to us. And of course, if we're in this middle of this water embrace, I could imagine I need to pay attention to acknowledgement to one of our elders that just passed away recently this week. No, and how I heard from her in a conversation. We were celebrating her mother's 90th birthday, and believe me, with records, Barrio Kroger Lane, and because of Miss Jennifer's research, no, Barrio Kroger Lane gets to celebrate its 102nd anniversary this year. So there was a city staff that asked, what are you all planning for this? I don't want to miss it. And I said, don't worry about it, because next year will be 103, 104, 105, until we get the attention we deserve. Because even though our barrio has lived, no, our elder says it's more than 100 and some. Our families say it's the 7th generation in the same area or same home. And across west is where the city discovered its original birthplace of Tucson. So if the original birthplace of Tucson is across from us, our families have lived in the same area for 7 generations. What does that make us? And then you go through our barrio. Yes, you can appreciate it, but there's a lot of unmet needs, a lot that still needs to improve and invested in. So going back to this conversation of this fiesta we were celebrating for one of our elders on her 90s, I heard her daughter saying about how the wooden bridge was there and how they used the sound of that wooden bridge when her father would come from La Calle. And if you read Dr. Otero's Lydia Otero's book of the Calle, and now Las Notitas, and now the freeway, you can read a lot of history there, as well as how houses were constructed. Dr. Otero says her mother and her sisters made her the adobe to build their home. So imagine how significant, how much work, equity, love, care, passion goes into those homes that are within the barrio. So I was asked when I moved into Barrio Coeur Lane, because even though Barrio Coeur Lane in Santa Cruz used to be one, but because of Star Pass, 22nd, we called it then. Now it's Star Pass because it went further, separated two barrios where family members and friends are in both barrios. And now gated communities. Again, gated communities and walls face the barrios, and the gated community is within one barrio that now has made it two barrios. So that's progress. No? That's progress. So I heard the daughter, that the elder that just passed away this week, saying about this wooden bridge. And then later I was asked, do you have pictures of this wooden bridge? And I said, wooden bridge? I wouldn't know because I know it was my father's area as a child, but I grew up in the Cottonwood area where there used to be ranches, irrigation, farms. And then when I married my husband, I jumped the river again and has lived in Barrio Kroger Lane. So from my research, I have learned from our elders that there was a wooden bridge on 19th Street. And because of the water flowing through and practically over flooding our barrio, that wooden bridge was removed and the Julian wash was cut, boarded, and it's beautiful areas. Wildlife still live there, but it's not within our barrio. So that wooden bridge, elders remember what it looked like, but it no longer exists. So I just want to add the credit to this elder that just passed away, that I just learned of her passing as I was coming to be part of this session. So we were just also talking about, Ms. Jennifer was mentioning about gentrification. When I was involved in community organizing 30 years ago, gentrification was such a bad word, was such an offense if you even mentioned gentrification. So I'm glad now that we're keeping it out, opening and having a discussion about it, because it's a learning tool. It's a learning tool, but not only gentrification, because it can be a beautiful building, but cultural gentrification. The culture gentrification hurts even more. Gentrification, beautiful building, raises the taxes. Culture gentrification separates human beings, displaces families, divides neighbors. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind. We've been having good neighbors coming in, but after a moment in the barrio, they can't understand or do not like or do not want the barrio ways of life. And there's a certain time of teaching, of learning, of sharing that could be improved, if that's what it's called, or understood. And meanwhile, there's a lot of hurt, damage that can be done to generations because of, in our barrio, culture gentrification separated a multicultural family, displaced a mother of 7 children. And now I see the children going through that trauma of when a neighbor called because of the children walking barefooted. And I need to say I was also raised barefooted, and some with a diaper and others without a diaper. So this child was walking with his dog barefooted in a diaper. So she reported, and instead of calling another neighbor, it was a 911 call. Police come and check. The families believed it didn't have enough food for 7 children, and neighbors sharing electricity from one house to the other. We still do that, when we can't have ends meet. And so children were replaced in an October evening in the middle of the night with strangers. So now I see the impact of these youth, of what they have been going through, being removed from their home by strangers in a cold October night. So, and this just happened recently. So just keep in mind, when we're bringing neighbors together, that we could grow to understand each other. And I'm very thankful for Celestial Favor, our nonprofit. I'm a co-founder, and Miss Shirley Roman is also a co-founder. She is from South and moved in to our barrio. And I asked her, Shirley, why would you even want to leave Sal's and come to Barrio? And she says, because it looks like Sal's. So for me, I took that so much at heart, because I also saw that spiritually, her ancestors must be claiming the area, because that area was also of the First Nation, of the first people on those areas, that it's proven fact that there was a village right across from us. And now it no longer exists, but there is a village that continues in San Javier district. So what do we imagine happened to this village closer to downtown? Most likely it was also displaced. And most likely it must have also been cultural gentrification. So just to keep us in mind, even though you're in this area for many years, I think there's always an opportunity and space to learn. And then there's the good story of this side too. We had this house that we were trying to purchase. We have a land trust, but at the beginning of our session, I just heard how funding is always a need and not enough of. Well, the same thing in a body. So we were wanting to buy this house because it's so significant that a building could have a story of its own, a history of its own. And I think that's so awesome. We learned about this small house that was for sale, needed a lot of restoration, renovation. And by just by asking, we learned that was a house also built by a family, the medicine woman of the barrios at that time. And her grandchild was also running free, I would say, barefooted throughout the barrio, and how she wanted that house back to restore it as her grandmother had it. A garden next to it, the chickens as well, and her medicine curing other children within the barrio. So all these medicine, wildlife, open space, people, culture, I think it's so significant to have it embraced in a whole development plan. We have now partnered up with a university and architect students assisting us in preserving what the nothing we have left within our barrio. But with sharing all the stories, I've noticed, and the students have said, how they want to be different. And I think it will be an impact of how further on we also can appreciate where we're working, what we're doing, and not think it's progress by making it totally different, but including of what is within it. I think that makes so much sense, and a change in the change in our world, really, because here we're now wanting to conserve more of our water, where water is life, where we should have done that in the beginning, and now we're struggling now. And with these homes, I remember in my childhood where my father was raised in Barrio Santa Cruz, just across the way. My grandfather was an adobe maker. And I remember like this little baby there in the middle of the screen. I was probably that size when I would see him. For me, that hole was deep, but maybe it wasn't, of him stomping on the soil, on his mixture of Mother Earth, of making those adobes. And And for me, that impact still stays. And it's beautiful now how we can appreciate now of how we can build and construct our own homes. And it's interesting how Ms. Jennifer said that this home is built and then it keeps on adding as the family is growing. And now is the needing, because in our barrio we have as we have generations coming back, not only as youth, but adults. Adults are returning back to our barrio, and either because it's, well, we have an incident of California, being harder to sustain there, and they're coming back to Arizona in our barrio to be more sustainable. So it's a circle of life. I would say that that I pray that we could understand and learn from our mistakes and not keep on committing them. Because then how is humankind, I won't just blame the men, no, the humankind learn from this experience. Because I've been learning at my age and learning from the history of our barrio as we're doing this research and waiting to be if we will be designated as a historical land place of Barrio Kruger Lane. But in the meantime, we're doing as much as work as we can to be preserved, and also restoration of those houses, because imagine those houses are now from 50 to 102, 3 years old. So, and the way the economy is, how we can restore those houses with what we have and what we can do to the best of the ability. Now the city has these ADUs, and I was part of the process, and I said, wait a minute, we've had these ADUs undocumented through it, all our barrios, all of these life, no? Because families have always lived in their casitas behind their families, or either are constructing now, no? So it continues on, and the need as interest is still there. So there's so much to share about our barrio, and I'm looking forward that we will be able to preserve as much as we can, at least in my time, because we don't know. This moment we're here, the next we don't. So I'm looking forward during our time of questions and answers to also learn from you. And if there's any questions on my side that I could assist with, and I also invite you to be part of our barrio preservation. There's a building of a 2-story house that's the memory of our elders as being their tiendita, their convenience store, to go and buy what mommy was needing for their meal that day. And also I learned from Senor Rodriguez that there's where he met his girlfriend, now his wife, at this tiendita. Then I heard from Juanita how she bought her little lunch and went up the mountain or in the river hunting with her brothers. No, so there must so much significant. So, and this 2-story house has been vacant, abandoned for 15 years, I would say. Now the association preserved it from being demolished. And now at this anxiety that I have, let's preserve. The association put the no trespassing, assisting the owner, but the owner hasn't come through. So how much is it to hold on to that no trespassing and coming and cleaning and fixing up and putting back that sign up to preserve it? Because that's what we're doing, similar to one of the land trust properties. We're in grassroots and recyclable material and volunteers and an affordable label or affordable material. We're restoring one of our historical houses that it's in the Ochoa lane, where one of the Ochoa's properties There was numerous of properties in that area that was purchased by one great-grandfather that divided properties to the rest of the Ochoas. Now we have less Ochoas, but one of the Ochoas said, we want to have this legacy of this house restored and save the history and the barrio story, the family stories, and also what our youth have been doing now in this house. So that's a dream that's coming true, but it's been taking a lot of work and funding that we don't have, but yet we make ends meet. And even though funding is needed, and it always will be, but let's do the best of what we can. And that's what we've been doing. So I thank you for this invitation, and I look forward to others, and gracias.
Perfect. Thank you so much. One of the things too, as Josefine had mentioned, is that how long has it been? A couple years now, I think, that you guys have been working towards a National Register Historic designation. Does that sound right? 2 years?
Yes, 5 years.
Yeah, so on and off, and then yes, it's sort of been interminably long. I've heard there's some good news that it's in review finally at the city, so that's great news. This is long in coming and severely overdue. So I'm looking forward to celebrating with you guys when that actually happens.
Yes, but we need a whole team to come in and preserve it, because imagine if it's historic and then they say, what? This is historic? And then others will say, yes, this is historic. Let's jump in there. So we need to have this balance, no?
Yep, I know. So, very similarly to Barrio Coger Lane, my involvement in Barrio San Antonio started with, some neighborhood folks reaching out. I will say for Barrio Coger Lane, I worked on the determination of eligibility part of it in the beginning. So the initial steps of that project. So Barrio San Antonio is sort of a similar situation where one of the concerns from neighbors when they approached me was that where they're located is along what's now called the Sunshine Mile Historic District, and that's along the Broadway corridor. And there is a zoning overlay over there in which it is basically encouraging multi-story, denser development. And the neighborhood, because they're right on the edge of that, was really concerned about what that would mean for their neighborhood. Are you going to start tearing things down? Are you going to put multi-story housing in there? What kinds of other kinds of properties were now going to be encroaching on their neighborhood, because that had always been historically an issue for them. And so, very similarly, we did some community outreach, we talked to neighbors, and the impetus behind them pursuing also historic designation was for some similar reasons. Also, too, there's more loss of the Mexican American community in the Barrio San Antonio neighborhood versus Barrio Coger Lane. Barrio Coger Lane has a much stronger Mexican American sort of elders that still live there in ways that they don't in Barrio San Antonio. There's still longtime families that were, descendants of those that originally helped establish and build out that neighborhood. But there's a lot of loss there, in part because it's close to the University of Arizona. So you get a lot of students that move in. Also, it's been a lot of U of A architecture school projects have happened there because it is considered, a lower income area. And so there's been lots of HUD housing, those kinds of things that are encroaching the neighborhood. Also, like Barrio Coger Lane, the National Register nomination for that has been sent to the National Park Service. So we're waiting to hear back, hopefully in January, about whether or not that gets designated as well. So it'll be a real win for Tucson, I think, with the designation of these two communities. It's long overdue. There's no other neighborhoods like this that I'm aware of in the state of Arizona that are looking for this kind of designation. So again, I'm really happy to see those move forward. And then lastly, the community of Randolph. This picture right here that I have on the screen is a picture of Kyle Muldrow, his family. He's the little guy in the middle. The shortest of the three boys, and that's him with his brothers and sisters in front of their first house in Randolph. Kyle was our community liaison on that project, and so a lot of our oral histories and photos and things like that we gathered came in part through Kyle. And then one of the other things with Randolph that we did is through the Arizona State Historic Preservation Office, as well as the ASU Black Archives. We did a community outreach event during Juneteenth, this past Juneteenth in June, in which we did, the archivists came out and they scanned photos and documents and things like that that people wanted to share so they could get archived at ASU, not just for their family, but so that researchers could also do it. Research on Randolph, because one of the challenges with Randolph is there's been so little information on the history of this community, apart from an oral history that was done back in the early 2000s by Getty LeSueur, which is a really amazing read if anybody wants to read it, called Not All Okies Are White. And then, so in addition to that, we did some, oral history interviews, and we were able to try to get as many personal stories in that National Register nomination. And that is the edited version of that is currently sitting on Catherine's desk. So if she's attending today, I hope she finishes it soon so we can get that out the door too. So those are some of the outreach that we've been doing with some of these kinds of neighborhoods that we just talked about. And I will say that doing historic designation with these working class communities is a little bit different than what we're typically as preservationists used to doing with a lot of the historic districts that we normally do designations for. So oftentimes with the neighborhoods that are very middle class, upper class, pretty much white neighborhoods, they're very hands off. It's very focused on the architecture. It's not very focused on the people that live there. And alternatively, with these neighborhoods, so much of the history and the significance is about the people. And so it's been a really nice, for me as a consultant, to be able to have the opportunity to actually get to know some of the folks that live in these communities and have them be actively involved in what's happening in the designation for the community versus being very hands-off. The consultant does the paperwork and kind of sends it in, and then that's the end of that relationship. So this has been really nice to be able to continue to have relationships with neighbors from these communities as part of this, part of these projects. And then I think we might be. And then in case any of you guys want to reach out to either of us, here's our emails if you want to. If you have any questions outside of the question and answer session today, feel free to reach out to us. Or if you have any projects that you're interested in and want to talk about more, I'm happy to do that. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you so much. I noticed there is a question here in the chat. So why don't we start there if other folks, and then if there are more questions, we can open it up.
Okay.
So there's one question in the chat from Doug Kupel. What town in Colorado is the La Raza neighborhood in? You said it went by too fast.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to, trying to give too much information in a short amount of time. But yeah, so La Raza neighborhood is in Montrose, Colorado. It is the only Mexican-American neighborhood in Montrose.
And there's more to this question. It says, what other working class neighborhoods are considered good examples of this type of historic resource in Arizona or elsewhere? And how has the National Register accepted a different additive view of integrity?
We don't know yet about well, let's start with the first part of that question. So what other kinds of working class communities have been designated in the state or elsewhere?
It says in Arizona or elsewhere. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. I think that most of the time what we see for this would be places like Chinatowns, like in San Francisco, for example. We see most of what I'm aware of anyway, is that most of them have been in much more urban areas, not this sort of more, we do have, an urban center in Tucson or Phoenix, for example, but mostly we're much more suburban in nature. So again, I really think that most of those would be with, like larger cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, those kinds of places, LA, where you'll see more of those kinds of communities getting nominated. But again, I don't know the depth or the breadth of it, other than my impression is that very few of these kinds of communities have been or are actively pursuing designation. And then as far as the last part of that question is sort of the integrity question, well, we're going to find out, because the arguments for things like additive growth and walls, those are arguments that are being made for both Barrio Kroger Lane and also for Barrio San Antonio. Those are nominations that are either have been reviewed or in the process of being reviewed by the State Historic Preservation Office. So Barrio San Antonio will be our first case study, because that one's going first to the Park Service for review. So we'll see what happens. I mean, the conversations that I've had with the Keeper's Office on these topics has been that if you make a compelling argument, we'll agree with you. So even though typically those additions and those walls and things would be something that would make a property ineligible, but if we can make the argument that it is also a cultural or sociocultural character defining feature or characteristic of these communities, then then they will agree with us. So yeah, so as long as we make a strong enough case, they said, then they'll approve it. But again, we won't know till January if we've been able to successfully do that.
Another question just got posted, and actually I think maybe both of you, Josefina and Jen, can help with this. Barrios is a similar neighborhood in Albuquerque where cultural events like La Pasadas and Machinas, I'm not sure if I said that correctly, tie the community together. Are there similar cultural event traditions in the Tucson neighborhoods, and are they included as contributing elements of the designation or potential historic district?
Well, I'll let Josefina start so she can talk about her own neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yes, we continue with our posadas that integrates all our neighbors, no? That gives the opportunity for all our neighbors to come together. And also the tradition of carrying the cross, the wooden cross up Sentinel Peak, a mountain, that was also founded in Barrio Kroger Lane, and it still exists, and the cross is stored in Barrio Kroger Lane. So yes, if it wasn't for the spirituality, traditions, and culture, I think it would be, well, that's what keeps us together, no? Our family ties.
Yeah, and I would say that there's similar traditions, but not to the extent of Barrio Kroger Lane, just because of the population that's there. But historically, at least in Barrio Kroger Lane, or excuse me, Barrio San Antonio, historically, there were, they still continue to do like community, like parties, block parties, things like that. There were some religious, sort of Catholic religious ceremonies that were taking place when they still had a church in the neighborhood, but the church doesn't exist anymore. But when that was there was still community events around the church. That would be processions and things through the neighborhood. But largely now, because the Mexican-American population there now is about 45% of the population versus the majority of the population. So there's not as many of those events anymore. And then as far as Randolph goes, right now, the biggest community event would be Juneteenth, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon there, because Juneteenth is a relatively recent holiday. But that would be the primary event in which people that have left Randolph come back to visit family. So those would be similar things. And those have all been, again, I don't know the extent of for Barrio Kroger Lane, but in Barrio San Antonio, that's mentioned in the nomination document. And then in Randolph, the revised Randolph nomination, that is talked about extensively in those. Yeah. As part of those community cultural traditions. Yes.
Also with Favor Celestial, we have designed a whole year calendar that each month we get together, and it's for a very significant reason. And now it's grown into a tradition that can say why we have formed it and what the outcome has come from it. And that with the hope of the intention of keeping our barrio together and strengthening it, of being diverse and bringing our community stronger.
Culture is always evolving. So I'll open it up. Are there any other questions?
Oh, I think I see some in the chat here.
Is there another one in the chat? Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I didn't see that. I'm curious to hear more about embracing culture in urban planning. Maybe a question for Josefina. Are conversations already happening with urban planners about this? What aspects of culture could you see being integrated into urban planning systems?
With when I hear urban planning, it would be with the city, with the government, with developers, no? So with us, what we've done with our research, we have designed a plan of how we would see our barrio preserved, as well as meeting the unmet needs, and working with the university to have a rendering of our own, to say, this is what we have grown to want to see within our barrio. So we're working on that, and also integrate the culture and traditions that I just mentioned within those plans. So that way the incoming neighbors are included on those plannings, as well as those community gatherings. Because the intention is to have peace and harmony within the area, within everyone's living space.
So Josefina, when did you guys get your park? That park that came in, because that was something you guys advocated for.
In the park, it was a small one, and in the 80s, 70s, I would say. And then in 2007, when the neighborhood association was developed, there was funding that we had worked on for a bigger project below Sentinel Peak that was part of Rio Nuevo. So the Rio Nuevo politics weren't coming through, so those funds were redirected and the park was extended.
Mm-hmm.
So 2009.
Yeah, because I know that there's been some of those kinds of projects. They're slow in coming, but there's some of those kinds of things that are starting to happen now that you guys have been asking for a long time.
Yes, but not fast enough.
No, I know, they never
are. Let's see. There is a nice comment. Sounds like someone just jumped off, but they did say how much they appreciated the presentation, especially Josefina, for how you shared your experience of your own barrio. If it looks like we're winding down in terms of questions. Donna, did you want to make a few last comments?
Yes. Please. I want to thank everyone for attending, and the questions and the presenters and stuff. I did in the chat give you the link that goes to many of the past webinars that APF and SHPO have presented. And so you can see those, look at them as many times as you want. And we will have a recording of this as soon as it gets processed and put up. You will be able to see it again, and feel free to share everything. We do have another webinar coming up at the end of January. Registration has not opened for that, but it will be on neon. So there will be a presentation from Vic Linoff, that is with Mesa Preservation Foundation, and then Marge from the Casa Grande, and then Jude from the Neon Museum in Tucson. So it should be quite interesting about saving them, repairing them, how do you get money to do all of that, et cetera, et cetera. So we hope that you will be able to attend that. And again, if you can't, you can eventually find it on our YouTube channel. So thank you again very much, everyone, for attending today.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Good.